Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Rslash Nuclear Revenge. In today's episode, a friend set up my dad, and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. Try to strong-arm evict me illegally? We'll see about that. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Doctor writes him the most passive-aggressive note, signing me off for 2 weeks instead of 2 days to teach him a lesson. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. A friend set up my dad, and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. This isn't my story, but it comes from my dad and other family members who witnessed it. Background: this all went down in the late 1970s when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in was in the UK, and was a stereotypical working-class town. The part of town my family lived in was run down, full of poor families, and had its fair share of crime, but it was close-knit, and everyone knew everyone. This will be important later. Now, my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid, and he had hated being at school, but aside from a speeding ticket, he had never been in trouble with the police. He was, and still is, a really talented musician, and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday, one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad, it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket. He was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before, and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving work as a bartender in the town center at around 10 p.m. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembers was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. These men beat up my dad with bike chains and a crowbar, literally to within an inch of his life. Luckily, 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off, the bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial gambling habit and owed a large amount of money to people who you really didn't want to owe money to. They had threatened Dave and told him that they would be looking for him to teach him a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He had bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work, and call up the loan sharks to let them know where Dave was. What a scumbag. The revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second was how best to get revenge. Bit of background on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and a career military man. He enlisted at the back end of WW2 at 17, stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaya and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy was a certified badass even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord, etc. that he knew, and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town, word traveled fast, and my grandfather was well liked, and had a bit of a reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who had attacked my dad. Apparently, these guys had been bragging about beating up a defenseless man from behind. These guys were career criminals with violent reputations, but my grandfather really didn't give a sh*t who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp, all 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then, so there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up bloodied with broken bones, shattered teeth, and the requirement to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked, both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labeled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. My grandfather used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumors about why they had been beaten up. Soon it had gotten round that these 5 guys had F***ed up, and had beaten up the wrong person. Not only that, but they had bragged about it and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility so that when they got out, no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would *T himself, knowing that my grandfather knew what he had done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave was not only a compulsive gambler, but also had recently turned into a heavy drug addict as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying his drugs from, when he would usually buy and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he was living, and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge drug deal going on at the address, and he thought he heard gunshots. He got 2 of his buddies to do the same. The police investigated, searched the house, and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of drugs in his home, as well as counterfeit bills, and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad could never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again, his parents disowned him, his girlfriend dumped him, he struggled to get a job with his record, and when he got out he had to move miles away as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body from the beating he took. My grandfather never told anyone what he had done until my dad asked him about it when he got really ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it. Try to strong-arm evict me illegally? We'll see about that. This happened back in 2010 when I lived in Winter Garden, Florida, with my husband and his dying uncle. Background: my husband and I moved in with his sick uncle after losing so much during the 2008 housing market crash in the US, like many of my husband's lawn maintenance customers. We also moved in with his uncle into a condo, because his uncle had stage 4 cirrhosis of the liver, and his self-entitled sister and her family refused to help take of him. My husband, a retired Seminole County Sheriff's officer, important later, and I got ourselves set in the condo's 2 bedrooms as his uncle had himself set up in the living room, including his bed. On the first day, we found dangerous black mold caused by a leaky dishwasher. On the second day, we found the master shower had loose tiles and a leaky shower head. On the third day, we found a nest of brown recluse spiders in the living room. We talked with his uncle about these problems and found out that the slumlord, friends with self-entitled sister Rslash and her family, was refusing to take care of the issues as required by law. We wanted to start legal actions then, but my husband's uncle talked us out of it several times. The slumlord was nice to us so long as my husband's sick uncle was alive. The very next day after my husband's uncle died was a completely different story. Slumlord had turned nasty, aggressive, and began to try and strong-arm evict us like we were nothing more than drug addicts, squatters. Slumlord even bowed up and aggressively tried to fight my husband when we dropped off our next rent check. He kept telling us that we had to move or else, but yet refused to follow actual FL laws to evict us. Slumlord and his corrupt Winter Garden PD code enforcement officer wife even recruit my husband's self-entitled aunt and uncle to start harassing about just moving even if we had to live in a tent. Self-entitled aunt, why don't you and my RSO nephew just move so they can rent the condo to another senior? Husband, we don't have anywhere else to go yet, and he must go through eviction laws or get into very serious trouble. Self-entitled aunt, you're nothing but trouble, retired SCSD officer nephew. You've been problems since the day you were born. Get out of their condo and stop being a problem for everyone. Who cares if you have to live in a tent? All of this made my retired SCSD officer husband, who specialized in uncovering corrupted law enforcement, very suspicious. We talked and began investigating slumlord and corrupt code enforcement wife. My first order was to place all rent into escrow with evidence of repairs that have been neglected. Second, I sent a notification of cease and desist of harassment to the slumlord and self-entitled aunt. Next, I researched public property tax records. Woohoo! Pay dirt there. Slumlord's condo wasn't registered as a rental property with the state of FL, and was paying far less in property taxes than slumlord should have been paying. Property tax records also showed that slumlord did not own the condo. It was still deeded to his mother, which I found out had been living in a retirement home for 5 years before my husband's uncle moved in. My husband found out that corrupt code enforcement wife had been inspecting and signing off on hers and slumlord's properties, including the condo, which is against FL code enforcement conduct laws. I found out from neighbors in the condo that slumlord had only been renting to seniors with severe health issues. My best discovery, though, next to tax evasion, was finding out that the Condo Owners Association had a very strict no renting/leasing policy, meaning your family had to live in the condo and couldn't be rented. The revenge. Now that we had all of our evidence, my husband and I began to knock down all of the slumlord's dominoes. My husband went and filed a complaint with the Winter Garden Police Department about corrupt code enforcement wife and her perjuring inspections on her family properties. My husband has a glowing record in Seminole County, and with the FDLE, for having over 200 clean arrests and taking down nearly 60 corrupt public officials, including Child Protective Services, in the early 2000s. This background helped push WGPD to open an investigation into corrupt code enforcement wife. They discovered that not only had she perjured inspections on her family's properties, but also on my husband's self-entitled aunt and uncle's property as well. This got corrupt code enforcement wife fired, stripped of her state enforcement officer's license, and convicted of multiple crimes. I sent all property tax fraud evidence to the FL's Property Tax Division. That got the state to investigate slumlord. The state found that not only did he commit property tax fraud on the condo, but also on a property that he was renting to his son and self-entitled aunt's son, along with business tax fraud and income tax fraud. Both slumlord's son and self-entitled aunt's son were also busted for possession of illegal narcotics with intent to sell when investigators came to the rental house they lived. I never expected that much fraud to be found from all of this, but I'm glad it happened. The business tax fraud of slumlord affected self-entitled aunt and self-entitled uncle as well, since they were his business partners. Self-entitled uncle then came under investigation by the USPS board, as he was the postmaster of Winter Garden. Self-entitled uncle lost his comfy job and pension after it was discovered how he was assisting slumlord in the tax fraud scam and for stealing money orders. All four were convicted of multiple white-collar crimes, had to sell their properties and most of their stuff, serve some form of time, and pay huge amounts of fines and restitution. Slumlord, his wife, hubby's self-entitled aunt, and hubby's self-entitled uncle, along with their sons, all went down for multiple crimes, both felonies and misdemeanors, all because they thought they could strong-arm evict us. Just proves how smart we tenants can really be when pushed. Also proves why everyone should know all rental laws, and how to research public records, because it can save you in the end. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Doctor writes him the most passive-aggressive note signing me off for 2 weeks instead of 2 days to teach him a lesson. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I should note that I was a pretty reliable employee. I was never late, in fact, I often got in early, and I rarely called in sick. At the time this happened, I had not called in sick for 9 months, and even then, the manager had sent me home. I had been up all night, swinging between burning hot and freezing cold, so I was obviously feverish, and I had been throwing up at both ends, shall we say. At one point at about 2 a.m. I was on the toilet, with my head in the sink, utterly miserable. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew I was lifting my head off the sink, and it was 7 a.m. I was due to start work at 12 that day, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. So I called up the manager. Let's call the manager Steve. Steve was known for being a real a-hole. He never believed anyone who called in sick except his best buds, usually other managers, never lowly staff, but often called in sick himself. A lot of the time we knew it was because he was hungover and not actually sick. The conversation went as follows. Me, hey Steve, sorry, I can't come in. I'm sick. Steve, with what? Me, I don't know. I think it might be the flu. I've been up all night being sick, and I have a fever. Steve, don't be stupid. If you had the flu, you'd be completely knocked out. I need you in. Come in or you're fired. Me, I can't. I just told you I can't stop vomiting. I passed out. Steve, growling angrily, either come in or bring a doctor's note, or you're fired. In the UK, you are legally allowed to self-certify for 5 days. This means you can tell your employer you are sick, and you do not need a doctor's note. If you're sick for more than 5 days, you then need a note. It is also illegal to demand a doctor's note during the self-certify period. I knew this, but I was terrified. This was during the recession. I couldn't afford to lose my job. So I got myself dressed. Almost passed out trying to do so. Then trudged to the doctor's some 25 minutes walk away. I end up sitting in the doctor's office for a little over an hour, which for walk-in was pretty good. I get in to see the doctor, and she is furious at me for coming in. You're not supposed to come to the doctor's when you have a cold or flu, and of course I knew I should be able to self-certify. She told me as such, saying I shouldn't be here and should have stayed at home. I then explained what had happened with Steve, and how he had threatened to fire me over this, and I couldn't afford to lose my job. I was struggling as it was. My doctor turned her anger towards my manager. She asked if I got sick pay from the company, and I said yes. He wants a sick note, does he? The doctor says. Okay. I'll give him a sick note. Now, my manager just wanted a note confirming I was sick, but instead my doctor wrote something along the lines of this. My name has come to the surgery because manager name has insisted she come in spite of the fact that this is illegal and all employees are allowed to self-certify. Due to being forced to make this unnecessary and highly dangerous trip when the patient is ill, has a fever of 39 degrees Celsius, and almost passed out in the waiting room, I am signing my name off for 2 full weeks to recover. Had my name been allowed to self-certify as is the law, they might only have needed a few days, but due to straining themselves, they now require 2 full weeks. They are not to be permitted to work until date 2 weeks later. The doctor said she would have signed me off longer, but this was the longest she could do without requiring further evidence. So basically, instead of just being off for a few days, I was now signed off for a full 2 weeks, and I'd be paid for it. I went to my place of work, at which point one of the duty managers saw me and asked me what the heck I was doing here. Go home. I was obviously very unwell. I explained what happened. They agreed to help me downstairs to Steve's office, and went with me inside. I handed Steve the note. He looked worried and tried to say I wasn't being serious about firing you. Well gee, when you angrily growled it down the phone it sure sounded like it. The duty manager then declared that they were going to drive me home. It was clear Steve wanted to argue, but had the sense to know he shouldn't. The duty manager then drove me home, made sure I was okay, then went back to work where they informed our union rep of what had happened. Steve had a disciplinary hearing where he was given a severe reprimand and a warning. Steve tried to argue he never said I'd be fired, and I was lying and just decided to go to the doctors, but the duty manager said they heard him admit to it when he said to me that he really didn't mean it. I felt better after a few days and enjoyed my 2 weeks off, fully paid, and enjoyed the nice weather we had. Meanwhile, Steve was forced to work overtime because we were short-staffed. So thanks to the doctor, instead of being off for a few days, I ended up getting a nice 2-week paid vacation, and Steve was given a final warning, all because he insisted I get a doctor's note. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.